The radar operator saw them first. Two contacts, low and fast, screaming in from the northwest across a flat grey sea. It was just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon on May 25th, 1982, Argentina's National Day, and aboard HMS Coventry, the Type 42 destroyer, turning hard in the South Atlantic swell. Every man at action stations knew exactly what those blips meant. Skyhawks, a force of the Argentine Air Force, bomb-laden, 50 feet above the waves, coming for them. But here is the thing the Argentine pilots already knew, the thing that haunted their pre-flight briefings. Coventry was not just any ship. She carried Sea Dart. And in the weeks since the task force had arrived in these freezing waters, that long, slim missile had become the single most feared weapon in the Argentine sky. Pilots called the Type 42s the Trap. To press home an attack on the British carriers, you had to get past them. And getting past them, more often than not, meant dying. Coventry had already proved it. In the days before, she and her sister ship had been deliberately stationed forward. Bait, you might say, deliberately exposed off the north of Falkland Sound to lure Argentine aircraft into the killing arc of her missiles. And it had worked. Her Sea Darts had already plucked enemy aircraft out of the sky. The Argentine squadrons had begun routing around her, flying lower, faster, more desperately, simply to avoid the reach of that radar-guided spear. So when those two Skyhawks appeared on the screen that afternoon, Captain David Hart Dyke gave the order to engage. The Sea Dart system woke. The launcher on the foredeck swung. And for a few seconds, the men of Coventry believed they were about to add 2 more kills to a tally that had made their ship a legend and a target in equal measure. What happened in the next 90 seconds would send Coventry to the bottom of the South Atlantic, kill 19 of her crew, and become one of the most agonizing what-ifs of the entire Falklands campaign. It would expose a flaw, not in the bravery of her men, nor even entirely in her famous missile, but in the brutal arithmetic of air defense in the missile age. A flaw that Whitehall had half suspected, that the Royal Navy had gambled on, and that the South Atlantic was about to lay bare in the cruelest way imaginable. This is the story of a weapon that genuinely terrified an enemy air force, a missile so effective that Argentine pilots changed their entire approach to avoid it. And it is also the story of how that same weapon, and the ship that carried it, met their limits on a single catastrophic afternoon, and what the Royal Navy learned in blood about the gap between a missile's reputation and its reality. To understand why those pilots feared the Sea Dart, and why that fear ultimately wasn't enough to save HMS Coventry, we have to go back. Back before the Skyhawks, before the task force sailed, before a single shot was fired, back to a Britain that, in the spring of 1982, was a nation in retreat, its empire gone, its navy shrinking, its government unpopular, and its place in the world increasingly in question. Because the Falklands War was never just about a cluster of windswept islands 8,000 miles from home. It was about whether Britain still counted. And HMS Coventry and the deadly missile she carried were about to find themselves at the very center of that question. In April 1982, Britain was not a country that looked ready for war. The decade had opened in gloom, industrial strife, double-digit inflation, unemployment climbing past 3 million. Margaret Thatcher's government, not yet 3 years old, was deeply unpopular, her approval ratings among the lowest recorded for any modern prime minister. The post-war consensus was breaking apart, the old certainties dissolving, and the great imperial confidence that had carried Britain through 1940 felt like ancient history. The Royal Navy embodied that decline more painfully than any other institution. This was the service that had once ruled the oceans, that had hunted the Bismarck and escorted the Arctic convoys and held the sea lanes that kept the island alive. By 1982, it was a shadow of that fleet. The 1981 Defense Review, drawn up by Defense Secretary John Nott, had taken an axe to the surface fleet. The carrier HMS Hermes was earmarked for disposal. Invincible was to be sold to Australia. The ice patrol ship Endurance, Britain's only permanent presence in the South Atlantic, was to be withdrawn, a decision the Argentine junta read, not unreasonably, as a signal that Britain no longer cared about the Falklands at all. And that was rather the point. In Buenos Aires, General Leopoldo Galtieri's military regime was itself in trouble, economically bankrupt, politically brutal, hungry for a unifying cause. The Malvinas, as Argentina called the islands, offered exactly that. A long-standing national grievance, a chance to reclaim territory Argentina had claimed since the 1830s, and an apparently distracted, declining Britain that surely wouldn't fight for 1,500 sheep farmers at the bottom of the world. They miscalculated. When Argentine forces landed on April 2nd and overwhelmed the tiny Royal Marines garrison at Port Stanley, the response in Whitehall was electric. Thatcher, facing the gravest crisis of her premiership, resolved almost immediately to send a task force. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, resigned within days, taking responsibility for the diplomatic failure to anticipate the invasion. The House of Commons sat on a Saturday for the first time since Suez, and from the green benches came a roar for action that crossed party lines. Labour's Michael Foot demanding the government honour its obligations to the islanders. The chiefs of staff were divided on the wisdom of it. To project naval power 8,000 miles from home with no land-based air cover against an enemy operating from the mainland was a staggering gamble. The first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Henry Leach, had been the crucial voice, arriving at the Commons in full uniform to tell Thatcher that yes, it could be done, and that if Britain did not do it, in a few months we shall be living in a different country whose word counts for little. So the task force sailed. A fleet improvised from whatever could be mustered. 2 small carriers, destroyers and frigates, requisitioned liners pressed into service as troopships, the QE2, and Canberra steaming south crammed with soldiers and marines. Among those warships was HMS Coventry, a Type 42 guided missile destroyer. She had been designed for exactly one purpose above all others, to defend the fleet from air attack. Her primary weapon was the Sea Dart, a long-range, radar-guided surface-to-air missile that was on paper one of the most capable air defense systems in the world. The question that the South Atlantic would soon answer was whether the paper matched the reality. Because the men aboard Coventry and the Argentine pilots who would soon face her were about to find out together. To understand the Sea Dart, you have to understand the threat it was built to kill. The Type 42 destroyer was a Cold War creature, conceived in the late 1960s to protect a naval task group from Soviet bombers and the long-range missiles they carried. The Sea Dart, built by Hawker Siddeley Dynamics, was its long arm, a ramjet-powered missile that could reach out more than 40 miles and climb to extraordinary altitudes, guided onto its target by the ship's Type 909 radars. It was designed to knock down high-flying aircraft and missiles long before they could threaten the fleet. In that role, against that threat, it was formidable. The trouble, as Whitehall's planners well knew, was that the South Atlantic in 1982 did not present the threat the Sea Dart had been designed against. The Argentine Air Force did not fly high. Their Skyhawks and daggers came in at wave-top height, using the curvature of the Earth and the clutter of the islands to mask their approach until the last possible moment. And Sea Dart, brilliant against a high-altitude bomber, struggled against a target skimming the waves. Its radar could lose a low-flying aircraft in the sea clutter, and the missile itself was never optimized for that knife fight at low level. HMS Coventry was commanded by Captain David Hart Dyke, a thoughtful and respected officer who understood his ship's strengths and her vulnerabilities better than most. He knew the Type 42 was a superb area defense platform and a far less capable close-in defender. He knew, too, that his ship's other weapons, the aging Seacat short-range missile, the single 4.5-inch gun, offered thin protection against a determined low-level attack. Coventry's safety lay in keeping the enemy at arm's length, in using Sea Dart's reach to kill aircraft before they ever got close. The Argentine pilots understood this perfectly. The men of the Fuerza Aérea Argentina and the Naval Air Arm were flying obsolescent American A-4 Skyhawks and French-built Daggers, aircraft with limited range that left them only minutes over the target area before they had to turn for home. They flew at the absolute edge of their endurance, often with no fuel reserve for combat maneuvering, and looming over every sortie was the knowledge of the Type 42s and their missiles. Captured Argentine briefing notes and post-war accounts make it plain. The Sea Dart was the threat they planned around. Routes were chosen to avoid it. Pilots were warned of it. The destroyers carrying it were treated as zones of death to be skirted at all costs, which created a deadly opportunity for the Royal Navy. If the Argentine aircraft were so frightened of Sea Dart that they would alter their routes to avoid it, then a Type 42 could be used as bait, stationed deliberately in the path of incoming raids, forcing the enemy either to face the missile or to fly around it into other defences. By late May, with British troops ashore at San Carlos and the vital beachhead under relentless air attack, the task force commander, Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, needed exactly that. He needed to push his air defences forward, away from the carriers, to break up the raids before they reached the landing area, and so HMS Coventry, together with the Type 22 frigate HMS Broadsword, was ordered to take up a position to the north of Pebble Island, forward, exposed, and alone. The idea was elegant. Coventry's Sea Dart would provide the long-range punch, while Broadsword's modern Seawolf system would handle anything that slipped through at close range. A missile trap, combining the two ships' complementary strengths. On paper, it was a clever piece of tactical thinking. The reality would prove far more fragile. The plan had a name within the task force, the 42/22 combo, and on the face of it, it answered Coventry's central weakness beautifully. Where the Type 42's Sea Dart was a long-range weapon that faltered against low-level attackers, the Type 22 frigate broadsword carried Seawolf, a fast, automated, short-range missile system specifically designed to destroy targets coming in low and fast, even sea-skimming missiles. Pair the two ships, and in theory you had defence in depth, Coventry striking at distance, Broadsword catching anything that closed the range, two ships covering one another's blind spots. For 2 days off Pebble Island, it worked spectacularly. On May 25th, the ships drew Argentine aircraft towards them again and again. Coventry's Sea Dart, finally given the kind of incoming targets it could engage, came into its own. She shot down a Skyhawk, then a helicopter. Her tally grew, and with it her reputation and her danger. The forward picket was doing precisely what Woodward had hoped, drawing the sting of the Argentine air effort away from the crowded, vulnerable anchorage at San Carlos, where the troops and their supply ships were desperately exposed. But there is a price to being bait, and the men aboard both ships felt it sharpening by the hour. They were operating without air cover of their own, well forward of the main fleet in clear weather on Argentina's National Day. a date everyone aboard knew would draw a maximum effort from the enemy. Captain Hart Dyke later wrote of the strange, taut atmosphere of those hours, the knowledge that they were succeeding, and the equal knowledge that the enemy would keep coming until they got through. In Buenos Aires and at the mainland air bases, the Argentine command had indeed marked the day for a major effort, and crucially, they had identified the forward picket as a target worth destroying. The very success of Coventry's Sea Dart had painted a bullseye on her hull. If the Argentine pilots feared the Type 42 above all other ships, then the surest way to break that fear and to clear the path to the British carriers was to sink one. That afternoon, the radar plots began to build again. A raid of Skyhawks from Group 05 was inbound, splitting into pairs, coming in low across the water from the west. The first pair pressed in. Coventry's Sea Dart engaged, but the geometry was awful. The aircraft were low, fast, masked by the land behind them, the radar fighting sea clutter. And then the two ships' carefully designed combination began, fatally, to come apart. As the Skyhawks bore in, Broadsword's Seawolf system locked on. And then, confronted by the multiple contacts and the maneuvering geometry, the computer suffered a moment of confusion and reset itself, dropping the lock at the worst possible instant. The automated shield simply switched off. One pair of Skyhawks roared over Broadsword and released their bombs. One struck the frigate a glancing blow, bouncing up through her flight deck and wrecking a helicopter, but failing to explode. Broadsword survived. But the trap had been sprung in reverse. The two ships, maneuvering hard to bring their weapons to bear and to comb the tracks of the incoming bombs, were now dangerously close together, and their movements were about to put Coventry directly into the firing line, while masking the very weapon that was meant to save her. The second pair of Skyhawks was already inbound, and Coventry, the ship the Argentines feared most, was running out of sea and out of time. The second pair of Skyhawks came in from the west, two A4s flown by First Lieutenant Velasco and Lieutenant Barrionuevo, hugging the sea, throttles open. Aboard Coventry, the Sea Dart system tried to engage, but the destroyer was turning hard, and in the chaos of the moment, her own maneuver and Broadsword's position conspired against her. As Coventry swung, she cut directly across Broadsword's line of fire. The frigate's Seawolf, the one weapon designed precisely to kill these low, fast attackers, had reacquired the incoming jets, and now found the friendly destroyer sliding into its sights, masking the target. The system would not fire on a solution with a British ship in the way. The shield was raised, and then, in the space of a heartbeat, it was blocked by the very ship it was meant to protect. There was no time. The Skyhawks released. 3,000-pound bombs found Coventry, punching into her port side and detonating deep inside the hull, in the computer room and the forward engine room. The blast tore the heart out of the ship. Power failed. Lights died. Below decks, men were thrown into darkness and fire and rushing water. Captain Hart Dyke had been in the operations room when the bombs struck. He was knocked unconscious, his face burned, and when he came to, the compartment around him was an inferno of smoke and flame and the dead. He has written, with extraordinary restraint, of the scene, of crawling out, of the faces of men he would never see again, of the dreadful speed of it all. Coventry was mortally wounded from the first instant. The bombs had ruptured her below the waterline and gutted her amidships. Within moments she began to list to port, and the list did not stop. It steepened with terrible, remorseless speed. The order to abandon ship came quickly, because there was no alternative. She was rolling over beneath their feet. What followed was, amid the horror, a kind of grim triumph of training and discipline. The crew got out. Men hauled their burned and broken shipmates up through canting passageways, across decks tilting towards the vertical, into the freezing water and the orange life rafts. Helicopters from the task force clattered overhead, winching survivors from the sea and from the rafts that drifted away from the dying ship. The South Atlantic in late May is murderously cold. Survival times in that water are measured in minutes. That so many got out owed everything to the seamanship of men working in conditions of unimaginable chaos. Coventry rolled completely over within about 20 minutes of being hit. She lay upturned on the surface, her hull a great red whaleback against the grey sea, before she slipped beneath the waves entirely. Of her company of around 300, 19 men were dead or dying, killed by the bombs, the blast, the fire, or lost in the freezing water. Many more were wounded and burned. For the Argentine pilots, it was the validation of everything they had told one another. They had done what their fear of the sea dart had told them was almost impossible. They had reached a Type 42 and sunk her. Velasco's section had broken the trap. And yet the cost to the Royal Navy, painful as it was, served the larger purpose, for while Coventry and Broadsword had drawn the Argentine air effort onto themselves, the same day saw the loss of the Atlantic conveyor. But the beachhead at San Carlos, the thing that truly mattered, had been shielded from the worst. Coventry had been the bait, and the bait had done its job to the very end. 19 men did not come home from HMS Coventry. They are remembered by name in their hometowns and aboard the ship that later carried their legacy, but the raw number scarcely conveys the loss. Young men, many in their teens and 20s, killed in the space of a few seconds in the cold sea off Pebble Island. For the families who received the dreaded visit in the weeks that followed, the abstractions of strategy meant nothing against an empty chair. For the Royal Navy, the loss of Coventry, coming alongside the sinking of HMS Sheffield earlier in the campaign, another Type 42, gutted by an air-launched Exocet, forced a hard and unwelcome reckoning. 2 of the Navy's modern air defense destroyers had been lost to air attack in a single, short war. The very ships built to protect the fleet from aircraft had proved horribly vulnerable to them. Questions were asked, quietly at first, and then more insistently, about the design of the Type 42, about the limitations of Sea Dart at low level, and about the wisdom of the whole air defense concept the Navy had bought into during the lean years of the 1970s. The truth that emerged was uncomfortable but important. Sea Dart was not a bad weapon. Far from it. Against the threat it had been designed for, the high-flying bomber, it was excellent, and the Argentine pilots' genuine terror of it was entirely justified. It accounted for several Argentine aircraft during the campaign and shaped enemy tactics profoundly. But it had been bought to fight a Cold War in the open ocean against the Soviets, not a close-quarters air battle among islands against low-level attackers. The mismatch between the weapon and the war was not a failure of courage or seamanship. It was a failure of anticipation, a peacetime assumption tested to destruction in wartime. There was, too, the bitter business of the bombs. A significant proportion of the Argentine bombs that struck British ships during the campaign failed to explode because they were being released from too low an altitude for their fuses to arm properly. Coventry was less fortunate than some. Her bombs went off. But the wider lesson was sobering. Had more Argentine bombs detonated as designed, British losses would have been catastrophically higher. The margin between victory and disaster in the South Atlantic was, at times, agonizingly thin, a matter of fuse settings and seconds. Captain Hart Dyke faced a board of inquiry, as was the custom after the loss of a ship. He was not found at fault. The loss was understood as the consequence of a calculated risk taken in good faith. The forward picket doing a dangerous job that needed doing. But the experience marked him, as it marked all who survived. He would later write movingly of the burden of command and the men he lost in an account that remains one of the most honest first-hand testimonies of the war. Beyond the navy, the political cost was contained, because Britain was winning. The loss of Coventry was a blow, but it came in the context of a campaign that was succeeding. The beachhead held. The troops broke out and began their march on Stanley. Had the war been going badly, the loss of 2 destroyers might have shaken Whitehall's resolve. As it was, the deaths were absorbed into the larger, grim accountancy of a war that, against considerable odds, Britain was on course to win. But the lessons of Coventry, about ship design, about air defence, about the gap between a weapon's reputation and its real-world limits, would echo through the Royal Navy for a generation. The Falklands War ended on June 14, 1982, when Argentine forces in Stanley surrendered. Britain had recovered the islands, restored its damaged prestige, and, almost incidentally, transformed the political fortunes of Margaret Thatcher, who would ride the Falklands factor to a landslide general election victory the following year. The country whose word, Admiral Leach had warned, might come to count for little, had instead reminded the world that it would still fight for its own. For all the talk of decline, Britain had projected decisive military power to the far side of the planet and prevailed. But the navy that came home was a navy with hard lessons to absorb, and the loss of HMS Coventry sat near the centre of them. The most immediate consequence was a frantic effort to plug the close-in air defence gap that had cost 2 destroyers. Within a remarkably short time, the Royal Navy was fitting its ships with the Phalanx close-in weapon system, a radar-directed Gatling gun designed to shred incoming aircraft and missiles in the final seconds of their approach. Exactly the threat that had killed Coventry and Sheffield. The whole philosophy of layered air defence was rethought, with far greater emphasis on the close-in fight that the Cold War assumptions had neglected. Sea Dart itself was improved and soldiered on in Royal Navy service for many more years, serving again in the 1991 Gulf War, where a Type 42 used it to destroy an Iraqi missile. The first successful combat interception of a sea-skimming missile by a British ship, a belated vindication of the system's potential when properly supported. The weapon the Argentines had so feared was not discarded. It was refined in the light of bitter experience. But the Type 42 design and the assumptions behind it were quietly understood to belong to a passing era. The lessons fed directly into the requirements for the next generation of air defence ships, and ultimately into the Type 45 destroyers that serve today, with their vastly more capable Sea Viper system built explicitly to handle saturation attacks by low-level threats. There was a human afterlife to the story too. The name Coventry was not allowed to die. A new Type 22 frigate, HMS Coventry, was commissioned in 1988, carrying the battle honours and the memory of the ship lost off Pebble Island, and her crew maintained the links with the survivors and the bereaved families of the original. The dead were commemorated. The survivors carried their memories, some quietly, some in writing, ensuring that the men who went down with the ship were not reduced to a footnote in a strategic study. For the wider story of Britain in the world, the Falklands and the loss of Coventry carried a particular resonance. The war had been fought, in large part, with equipment shaped by Cold War priorities, kit designed to fight the Soviet Union in the North Atlantic, pressed into service in a very different conflict in the South. It exposed the danger of preparing only for the war you expect, rather than the war you get. And it reminded Whitehall that the defence cuts of 1981, which had nearly cost Britain the Endurance and signalled weakness to Buenos Aires, had come within a whisker of leaving the country unable to respond at all. The Knot Review was quietly reversed in its most damaging particulars. The carriers were reprieved. The lesson, that a maritime nation pares back its navy at its peril, was learned, at least for a time, and at a price paid in ships and men. So why did Argentine pilots fear HMS Coventry's Sea Dart more than any ship? Because it worked. Because in the skies over the Falklands, that long, slim missile genuinely shaped how an entire air force fought, forcing pilots lower, faster, and more desperately than they wanted to fly, draining their fuel and their nerve, and killing those who took the risk of facing it head on. The fear was real, and it was earned. A weapon that can change an enemy's tactics without firing a shot has already won a kind of victory. And yet the deeper lesson of Coventry is more humbling than any tale of a wonder weapon. It is the story of the gap that always exists between what a weapon is designed to do and what war actually demands of it. Sea Dart was built for one war and sent to fight another. It performed magnificently in the role it was built for and faltered in the role it was forced into. And 19 men died in that gap. In the few seconds it took 2 Skyhawks to cross the sea that the missile could not properly defend. The bravery of Coventry's crew was never in question. What failed them was not courage, but the limits of the kit, the assumptions of a peacetime treasury, and the brutal geometry of a low-level attack that no amount of valour could overcome. There is something quintessentially British in this story, in the improvisation of a task force flung together from a fleet marked for the scrapyard, in the cool professionalism of men abandoning a capsizing ship in freezing water, in the quiet honesty of a captain who wrote down what he had seen so that it would not be forgotten. The Falklands was the last gasp of one kind of Britain, the imperial maritime power, and the proving ground of another, a country that could still, when it had to, do hard things at the far edge of the world. HMS Coventry lies today off Pebble Island, an official war grave, her upturned hull resting in the cold dark of the South Atlantic. The men who died with her are remembered. The ship that bore their name carried their honour forward. And the lessons of that afternoon, about the danger of fighting the last war, about the price of underfunding a navy, about the difference between a weapon's reputation and its reality, remain as sharp today as they were in 1982. In an age when Britain once again debates how much of a navy it can afford and what it might one day be asked to do. That, perhaps, is the truest legacy of HMS Coventry. Not just a ship lost, but a lesson written in steel and salt water about what it costs to be a nation whose word still counts. What do you make of it? Was the forward picket a justified gamble that helped win the war, or a risk that cost too many lives? I'd genuinely like to hear your view, so drop a comment below and let's talk it through. If you found this worth your time, do give the video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into Britain's military and Cold War history. There's a great deal more of this story still to tell, and I'll see you in the next one.